Hey, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. I am at some busy intersection near downtown Las Vegas, Nevada, in a community where you don't really picture churches. I mean, Las Vegas is about other stuff, right? But this church is almost as old as the town. It's Christ Church Episcopal, and the guy who's in charge here is a man named Reverend Barry Vaughn, and he's been willing to sit down with me and process through the history of this church, the theology of this church, and the bigger picture of the Episcopal Church in general. So let's go inside and check it out. Barry Vaughn?
Hi.
Hi, I'm Matt Whitman.
Matt, it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
Welcome to Christ Church.
Reverend Vaughn.
Barry, please.
Barry.
That's what I prefer.
Easier. Okay,
yeah, it is,
good deal. Good deal. Do you mind just showing someone who knows nothing about this around and letting me poke at things and ask questions?
Come on in.
Cool.
Christ Church is the oldest church in Las Vegas. We were founded in 1907.
Okay.
And the building you're seeing, though, was built around 1960. Obviously, Spanish mission style, indigenous to the Southwest. The Episcopal Church generally strives for good values in terms of arts, architecture, music.
So a space like this, I mean, it all means something, right? What does having a courtyard like this mean? What does it communicate theologically to have it built this way?
That's a good question. I wouldn't say that it really has a profound theological meaning. I mean, no more than a courtyard at your church would, or a Presbyterian church. To me, what it signifies that's important to this church is welcome. One of my favorite things about being the pastor of this church is when I give communion on Sunday, I have a black couple, a white couple, a Latino couple, a gay couple, a homeless guy, and a former U.S. Senator, all receiving communion at the same time.
Wow. So the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church, historically, does Episcopal just mean Anglican Church not in England?
More or less. That's not a bad way of putting it. We are part of the worldwide family of Anglican churches, or the Anglican Communion. Prior to the American Revolution, we were all members of the Church of England. You know, George Washington was a member of the Church of England, and other people like that. Obviously, you can't have the Church of England after you've just thrown off English rule.
Yeah, sure.
So 1787, the remnants of the Church of England met in Philadelphia and said, hey, we need a new name, and they call themselves the Episcopal Church, which simply means a church ruled by bishops, episcopoi.
So the Episcopal Church, if that definitionally means not in England, it means that this has to be a church that's very adaptable, because this is in the age of later colonialism and all of that. So in a way, I feel like this space does come with a secondary theological assumption, which is that this message about Jesus should go out to the farthest reaches of the world, because this is not what the part of the world where Jesus happened looks like. I mean, that's
a good way of putting it.
The exact opposite end of the world.
Yeah, one way you could put it is that the Anglican Communion is a missionary church. Everywhere it exists because missionaries came there.
So all of your organization stuff, your classroom stuff, it's all this direction.
Right.
And I'm guessing the tall thing here is where we do worship.
Yeah, that's the sanctuary, or the nave, as it's officially called. Welcome to Christ Church again.
This is neat. Oh, you do have the full organ thing.
Yeah, we do.
All right, I won't.
Yeah, my organist likes to say it's the biggest organ in Nevada.
This is, first thing I noticed walking in, you've got pews like I'd expect to see in a New England church or an old Baptist congregation.
Yep.
Is that just a function of history, or is there a reason for having pews?
As you know, in the medieval church, there were no pews. The nave was empty, and people would bring seats with them, or their servants would bring seats for them. And you'll see a lot of churches today, including Episcopal churches, trying to go back to that with more flexible seating. For us, it's a function of two things. One, cost, and two, people are just too traditional to give up pews right now.
Well, and this makes it easy to have the kneeling benches. We don't do this either.
Yeah. Churches that are being built today probably are less likely to have kneelers. Their old rule used to be sit to listen, kneel to pray, stand to praise, which is pretty good. I like that. It's good theology, I think. But honestly, the main thing is that people pray, not whether they sit, stand, or kneel to do it.
So, okay, somebody comes in, the first thing they're going to see is this stained glass window. What am I seeing here?
One thing that's interesting about Christ Church is most liturgical churches are oriented And it's set up so that the theology of the church kind of begins here at the door. Okay. So the font is right here at the door, because the entrance to the church is through baptism, right?
Oh yeah, this is actually where you do baptisms?
It's not.
Okay.
It's a symbolic font.
Okay, all right.
And maybe in the past they did baptisms there. Again, practicality means that we want people to see baptisms taking place. So we always do baptisms at the altar now, where everyone can see it.
This room looks completely unfamiliar to me. I don't think we have anything that this rings a bell with.
This is our columbarium. Not a lot of churches have these, but more and more are going to it. I think 90% of the funerals I've done have been for people who were cremated.
Okay.
And we can take the ashes and put them here. So this is a permanent resting place for people's ashes.
Are we allowed to poke our heads in
here? Yeah, absolutely. Go on in.
Wow.
One of the great things about this is, you know, in the past, you do the funeral in the church and then go to the cemetery for the burial.
Sure.
But when I do a funeral of someone who's been cremated, we have the service and walk right back here, place the ashes here, over and done with. And I like that. The whole service takes place right here, and people can participate in all of it.
So are these church records? Is this?
Yeah, this is from the old church. Not too long after the church was built on this location, they invited the Archbishop of Canterbury to speak here, and so that's where he signed the book.
Yeah, it took me a minute to catch on. Okay, yeah, I would probably put that up too.
I know, yeah, it's kind of significant.
Any archbishops of anything come to our church ever.
Yeah.
So we step in here, everything opens up hugely. Is there seating up above?
The choir is seated up there.
Oh, that's right. Choirs.
Yeah, choir loft.
This thing couldn't have been cheap. And you've got a choir and you have people putting energy into all of this. Why do you have music in church? What does music mean theologically to you guys?
First of all, we have a choir up here. The primary choir is the congregation.
Okay.
The choir up here is secondary. Its function is to lead the praises of God's people. That's its only function, really. I mean, they do solos, they do anthems and all that, but that's all secondary to leading the praises of God's people. The Christian church has been a singing faith from day one. And Jesus sang a hymn after the Last Supper when he went out into the garden, right? Mm-hmm. So we've always been a singing church. Well, it goes beyond that to the temple and the synagogue. Mm-hmm. There are as many different expressions of church music as there are Christian churches. I used to teach a course in liturgy at the Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia. Okay. And the main thing I tried to get across to my students was that the architecture determines the style of worship. In a church like this, organ and choir fit.
Yeah.
In a New England congregational church, you'd want to do something simpler. In a Gothic cathedral, you want incense and the whole 9 yards.
In a warehouse, industrial, coffee shop, you might as well just get the rock band.
Exactly. That's what you need for that cultural situation.
This light seems intentional to me.
It is.
Candle hanging down, what does that symbolize? What does it do?
That is the candle of the presence. And it symbolizes the fact that the bread and wine in the silver box under the crucifix has been blessed at the altar on Sunday. The reason that there's bread and wine there is primarily so that we can take it to people who are sick or couldn't come to church on Sunday for whatever reason.
So that's why it's in there right now during the middle of the week.
Exactly. It's more of a convenience than anything else.
Is that candle ever out?
It's if there's nothing in the box, then the candle should be out. And it's always extinguished on Maundy Thursday, Thursday of Holy Week. Because after the communion service on Maundy Thursday, we take everything out. Because in the end of the service on Thursday night of Holy Week until Easter Day, we don't have communion. That is a symbol of the suffering and death and burial. It's a sign of, if you will, a sign of absence. And then it comes back on Easter.
So apart from a liturgical calendar that is an interesting teaching tool that you're describing to remind us of the story of the Bible, but attached to a liturgical calendar.
Right.
This becomes an annual reminder
Right.
of what the theological transaction that was actually happening
Right.
with the cross, the resurrection, and the interim.
Exactly.
That's a really profound and unique way to communicate a truth that, for me, is primarily done by trying to think of new words to illustrate it each year.
That's one of the things I love about the Episcopal Church, the way symbols communicate theology.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most powerful ways of that is the liturgical calendar.
I'm understanding that better the more we talk. At the Greek Orthodox Church that I went to, me being here made sense. Me being up here did not make sense. Is there a difference between right here and right here in your church?
You can go anywhere in this church you want to go.
Okay. Can we?
Well, if you're not afraid of getting struck by lightning.
I am afraid of that, but I feel relatively safe if I'm by you.
I think you're all right.
Like,
You're safe enough. So
you would call this an altar?
Yes, that was the original altar. And prior to 1970s, 76 or so, maybe a little before that, the priest would have celebrated with his back to the congregation.
Okay.
And then again, the liturgical reform movement came along and they said, no, we need to face the people. And so they put in another altar.
Okay, so now this all happens here.
Yeah.
And people participate. Do you bless the elements here, or does that happen before the service?
No, we bless, everything takes place publicly in front of the people.
You've got this rail, and so I'm assuming that people come up and receive this directly from you?
Yeah, they do. People come forward for communion, and they usually kneel. They can stand if they'd rather, or for whatever reason they can't kneel. Standing is just fine. Also, if someone is even more disabled, if they're in a wheelchair, we'll take communion out to them. Okay. But the norm is for people to come up and receive it. In a way, that's the altar call in the Episcopal Church. I issue an altar call every Sunday. I invite people to come up and receive the body and blood from me. And when I say body and blood, I would have a lower church understanding than some clergy. For me, the bread and the wine are the sacrament of Christ's presence, but not literally Christ's presence.
So he is here with us. He is participating with us in the act of communion.
Right.
But that is not some Platonic transferal of essence.
In my opinion, no, I wouldn't say that.
Okay, I'm tracking. Who can respond to the call? Who can take communion?
Well, that's another good question. And thinking about that has been changing. Traditionally, we've always said any baptized Christian can receive communion. But I have met more and more people who have experienced the presence of God in communion, and for them it's been a conversion experience. Wesley actually spoke of communion as a converting ordinance. And I'm not saying he gave communion to unbaptized people. I don't know what Wesley did, but I finally came to the conclusion that I can't refuse communion to anybody, whoever they are. So I just say anyone that wants to follow Jesus is welcome to receive the bread and the wine.
Well, I mean, have you ever had somebody respond to that invitation with that language and be like, hey, that was actually my first communion ever?
Yeah, I have.
Can we sit and talk about this?
And it kind of opens the door to the conversation then. Well, if you want to receive communion, why don't you go ahead and get baptized? And that's happened too.
I promise you, somebody who is in the third chair sitting in on our conversation here on the internet already has their fingers on the keys right now. And now they're taking them away because they're like, oh, he knows what I'm doing. and they're getting ready to light you up for that.
I know that'll happen.
What would you say to the person who would say, no, like this absolutely is like the final ordinance of the church. Mm-hmm. This demonstrates an already established communion with Jesus and the other saints, and you're using the wrong ordinance to reach out to people.
Yeah, I mean, I get that.
Help me quell their fingers. What is your thought?
Well, one really practical question is, were the apostles baptized?
Well, that's quite the question, isn't it?
And I don't know the answer to that.
They'd been in water before.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So in theory, the understanding is that the trajectory of becoming a part of this church would be baptism at an early age or as an adult, either way, right? Mm-hmm. Then some kind of confirmation or process by which people understand and assent to a certain expression of or a certain level of understanding of the theology of what you believe. And then communion is something they're able to fully participate in. What you're saying is those two steps are something that your congregation has agreed to say, we still care about these things, they're still happening.
Right.
That's still maybe even our ideal trajectory.
Yeah.
But you feel this table should just be open to, that it should be up to the individual as to whether they're in relationship with Christ.
That's how I feel. I just can't sit in judgment on anybody. If someone comes forward for communion, I'm going to give them communion.
So this point of view, is that your read on things, or is that what Episcopals do now?
There's a debate in the church right now. There are people that would say that it still should be baptism first and then communion. I think more and more people are saying, no, we issue the invitation and let people make up their own mind about that.
You really have opened up the side door.
I really have. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the tour, and thank you for sitting down with me to let me pester you even further here.
Sure.
I think for a lot of people watching this, the question is going to be, there's some vague association between Anglicanism and the Episcopalian Church. Where do these two groups fit together, and where do they fit in the grand scheme of church history?
Sure. The Episcopal Church was the first branch of the Church of England formed outside the British Isles in the late 18th century. But to take it back a couple of steps, the Church of England and Anglicanism in general got its start in the 16th century as part of the Reformation. There are 3 or 4 main parts of the Reformation, depending on how you look at it. Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, the Anabaptists, and the Church of England. Excuse me. And the Church of England, in a sense, is the most conservative branch of the Reformation. Conservative in the sense that while Luther to a degree, Calvin to a much greater degree, and Anabaptists even more, throughout much of the medieval church, we retained much of the medieval church. So we retained the offices of priest, bishop, and deacon. We continued to make Holy Communion or the Eucharist the central service of the church. Like Luther and Calvin, the Church of England wanted a vernacular liturgy, that is a service of worship in the language of the people. So Luther had the German language, Calvin French.
I respect that.
Yeah.
People hustle by here.
Yeah. We had the Book of Common Prayer, English prayer book.
How connected to Roman Christianity is English Christianity through the Middle Ages? I mean, you got water in between the two. I mean, It feels like culturally there's a little bit of a difference there. Is there already a drift happening before the Reformation, or is it pretty in lockstep?
There are people who say that English Christianity prior to the Reformation England was the most papal country of Europe.
More than Spain, more than France.
At
more than
least
the Holy Roman Empire.
Much, or if not more.
And
Henry VIII was a deeply committed Roman Catholic. When Luther launched the Reformation, Henry wrote a book called The Defense of the Seven Sacraments, which was an attack on Luther. And Henry was actually a very learned man, especially in theology. And so for writing that book, the Bishop of Rome, i.e. the Pope, gave Henry and all his subsequent descendants the title Defender of the Faith. And the irony is that even though the monarchs of England now are Protestant, they're still defenders of the faith.
So that's part of their heraldic titles.
That's right. That's part of their title. Queen of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and Defender of the Faith.
Really?
Exactly.
But it's a Catholic title.
It's a Catholic title.
And I don't think of England as being very Catholic.
Not anymore.
But I mean, if somebody gives you that, why would you give it up?
Right, yeah, you may as well keep it.
I'd keep that forever, give it to my kids.
So what happened, though, was that Henry was the second Tudor monarch to come to the English throne.
Okay.
And he came to the throne at the end of a century of violence and civil war, at the end of the Wars of the Roses. Because his hold on the crown was challenged by some. Now, a lot of people say that the Church of England came into being because Henry wanted to divorce Catherine and marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn. That has nothing to do with it. Henry could have had as many mistresses as he wanted. He was king, and nobody cared what the king did. What he needed was a legitimate male heir. And the two parts of that are significant are legitimate and male. And he believed that God had cursed him because he'd married his brother's widow. So he took the most radical route, but the only possible route he could do, and that was he declared that the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, no longer had authority over the Christian church in England.
On what grounds?
Remember that Eastern Christianity had been governed by the emperor?
Sure. Yeah.
So Henry borrowed this idea from Eastern Christianity called Caesaropapism. That is that the ruler is not only ruler of the state, but also ruler of the church. Okay. That the crown not only appoints civil officials, but also appoints the bishops of the church.
Which the Catholics would have seen different because of the investiture controversy.
Exactly.
So Henry's got to go over the top of that to something much older.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
He went back to something much older.
Okay.
And so he had Parliament declare him the supreme head of the church in England. And he appointed Thomas Cranmer to be Archbishop of Canterbury. And Cranmer had actually proposed this idea to Henry, namely that he throw off papal authority. And so once Cranmer was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, then Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine to be null and void.
Okay.
As long as Henry was king, though, the Reformation in England was pretty much stalled. It was Catholicism without the Pope. Henry reigned from 1509 to 1547, and I've forgotten the exact date. The Act of Supremacy by Parliament was in the 1530s. And so from the 1530s till the end of his life, Henry was, in effect, the Pope of the Church of England. But the liturgy continued to be celebrated in Latin. Clergy were required to be celibate. Cranmer married, but he married secretly because Henry did not favor married clergy. And it wasn't until...
So Henry can get married, like,
yeah, but Cranmer couldn't.
5, 6, 7, 8 times.
Right.
But, man, that's a tough deal.
Exactly.
A tough boss.
So his second wife, Anne Boleyn, also did not bear him a son. She bore him one child, Elizabeth, who eventually does succeed Henry as the ruler.
Yeah, she worked out.
She worked out pretty well.
Yeah.
It was his third wife, Jane Seymour, who actually was the one that gave him a son. And his son, who became Edward VI, came to the throne when Henry died in 1547. And Henry had entrusted Edward's education to Protestants. So when Edward became king, then the Reformation really got started. It was after, in 1549, 2 years after Henry died, that the first English prayer book was published. At the same time, they also published a statement of faith that ultimately became the 39 Articles, which is a mildly Calvinist statement of faith.
Okay. And that's different from the Westminster Confession that a lot of people associate with, what is that? Is that during the era of King James?
Yeah,
17th
the
century
Westminster
statement?
Confession is about a century later, and that takes place during the English interregnum between the death of Charles I and the advent of his brother, Charles II.
So that's when Cromwell's in charge.
Right, exactly.
Okay, okay. I think I'm getting the timeline nailed down. So
it's confusing.
So who is considered the founding monarch of Anglicanism? Is it Henry, Edward, or Elizabeth?
Well, that's a good question. A lot of people would say Henry was, but he really wasn't. Like I said, he favored very few changes in the Church of England. His son, Edward, was only 9 years old when he became king. So it was really the regents who ruled on his behalf, who authorized the liturgical and theological changes.
Okay.
Then Edward died in 1553, and his half-sister Mary Tudor came to the throne, and that was Henry's daughter by his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And she was a devout Roman Catholic and did everything she could to turn back the clock. So she reinstituted the Catholic faith. She had at least 300 Protestants burned at the stake.
Thus the
in
nickname.
London. And that made her very unpopular. So she died in 1558, and her half-sister Elizabeth came to the throne. So it's really Henry's daughter Elizabeth I who becomes the primary architect of the Protestant Church of England.
Okay. As an outsider looking in, if you said Episcopal or Anglican, my uninformed read would be kind of Catholic, kind of Protestant. How did we land on how much Catholic looking and how much Protestant looking it ended up being?
Well, wouldn't you say that all Christians are Catholics?
Yeah, I think that's one of those
Catholics.
tricky words, though, where maybe not everybody knows what that means. So Catholic, what is that word?
Well, a Catholic holding the universal Christian faith.
Okay.
You know, subscribing to the Apostles' Creed. So all of us are Catholic with a small c. We all hold the Bible as the rule of faith. Most of us would regard the Apostles' Creed as an accurate summary of the faith. We'd all practice the two dominical sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. I regard the Anglican Communion as a Protestant church, and the Episcopal Church, being part of it, is a Protestant church.
Okay.
But in the 19th century, there was a reform movement in England called the Oxford Movement. And this involved figures like John Henry Newman, John Keble, Edward Pusey. They wanted to reemphasize the Catholic element in Anglicanism. Since then, it's been more difficult for Anglicans to tell people whether they're really Protestant or really Catholic. But I think if you really look at the way we're set up, but the fact that lay people really have freedom to decide issues for themselves, that looks Protestant to me.
So in terms of decision making, do you have congregational elements?
We do have congregational elements. But remember that Luther and Calvin were not Congregationalists. They didn't favor a congregational model of the church. They favored rule by clergy. And that's essentially what we have. Episcopal in our name means that we are a church of bishops. But having said that, the Episcopal Church, when it was organized in the 1780s, made a lot of decisions that make us more congregational in a sense. Our bishops are elected, they're not appointed. And each parish church is free to call its own priest with the bishop's permission.
So rounding out the timeline here, it sounds like Episcopal was meant to be the expression of Anglicanism that exists in the Americas and outside of England. But when I look around town now, there are Anglican churches that say Anglican, and there are Episcopal churches. What happened? Was there a redivide or a reconnection that occurred?
It's the nature of Protestant churches to split. We've had fewer splits, I think, than most Protestant churches. But in the last 50 years, the Episcopal Church has made some decisions. We decided to ordain women to the offices of priest and bishop, and that provoked a split. So, but now, virtually every branch of the Anglican Communion does ordain women to the office of priest and bishop.
If I were to say, what's the most basic stuff that you believe about God and man and the Bible, what are the highlights?
Well, as I said, I consider this to be a Protestant church. So like all Protestants, we would believe that we're saved not by our own efforts, but by God's decision. I like to say that salvation isn't our achievement, it's God's gift to us. What sets us apart would be the fact that if you came to Christ Church on a Sunday morning, the church would look, the service would look very Catholic with a big C.
Okay.
Because our liturgy sounds like the liturgy you would find across the street at St. Anne's Catholic Church. Our vestments would look very similar, but that's part of what I meant by saying that we are the conservative branch of the Reformation, and that we kept a lot of things from the medieval church. So it's really a matter of emphasis. And between the two elements, word and sacrament, we put more emphasis on sacrament. The word is there, and I think we actually have pretty good preaching in the Episcopal Church in general. But one of the reasons I became an Episcopalian is because of the emphasis on sacrament. The sacrament, in a sense, human personality doesn't get in the way.
Okay.
You know, the sacrament is God's offer of himself to me in the bread and the wine at the altar. So that's a transaction between God and me. If the sermon is not a very good sermon, then I don't get as much out of it. But the sacrament is always the sacrament.
So skeptical, more trendy, modern Protestant goes to a more stripped down version of church, comes along and they're like, well, why the conservatism? Like, what was the advantage of hanging on to those Catholic elements? You've listed one, the sacramental, God approaches us. What are the other advantages? What are the other things that you feel were rightly preserved from medieval Christianity?
I think that what that does for me is it tells me that I am a part of a church that has roots going back 2,000 years. The service that we have here on Sunday would have been recognizable to Hippolytus in Rome in the year 150.
Yeah, and I think what we do would be disorienting.
It might be.
Yeah.
I think that you do have to respond to your culture, and you have to have something that is culturally that translates culturally. So Christianity takes one form in this culture; it takes a different form in Africa, and yet another form in China. But I think that we have put the emphasis on those elements that are the same pretty much in all times and in all places.
So this channel is called the 10-Minute Bible Hour. I talk about the Bible a lot. I like to talk about where it came from, how it happened, how different people read it. And I think a lot of people who watch this channel are really interested in that stuff as well. So what is your read? What is the Episcopal read on what the Bible is and how it happened and what we do with it?
Probably the single most important theologian the Anglican Church has produced is a guy named Richard Hooker, who lived in Elizabethan England. And Hooker borrowed a phrase from Proverbs, and he said that the Christian faith is like a threefold cord, not easily broken. And he said the three elements of the cord are Scripture, tradition, and reason. Or you could also say it's a tricycle. You have two little wheels, tradition and reason, but the primary one is Scripture. It's the big wheel on the tricycle. Other people would phrase it differently. That's my personal way of expressing it. But I don't think you can understand Scripture unless you apply reason and tradition to it. And the word tradition can be a hot button for some people. The Catholic Church uses tradition in a very different way than I'm using tradition. For me, tradition is simply the ongoing conversation that the Christian Church is having. I don't think any of us has ever read the Bible alone.
Right.
Every time we pick it up, we are in conversation with every sermon we've ever heard, every Bible study we've ever been in, every person we've ever discussed Scripture with.
Every heresy that's ever been repeated?
Every heresy, yeah, exactly. So that's what tradition means to me. And reason is just obvious. Scripture is written in Hebrew and Greek. We can't understand it unless we apply a reason to it. We can't understand the cultural context unless we do some historical research. Why did Paul say that women should cover their heads? Well, it's because in Corinth, prostitutes walked the streets with their heads uncovered. It was not a directive to people for all time. It was specific to that one situation. So, so Scripture is a part of this Anglican triad or threefold chord. It's the dominant or the senior element among the three elements. And I have no trouble saying that Scripture is God's revealed truth. But I like what Bart said. Scripture is, Christ is the Word. Scripture are the words about the Word. They are not the Word itself.
Okay. After this conversation, I would love to come and sit on a service sometime. And so next time I'm in town, I'm going to. If somebody else is in Vegas or rolling through town, how do they connect with you?
Our website is ChristEpiscopalLV.com.
LV, Las Vegas, got it.
Yeah.
Okay. What if somebody's not in this part of the world and they just want to learn more about the Episcopal Church in general?
Just look up the Episcopal Church on the internet, and that will connect you with a local church.
Okay. And statement of faith and all of that stuff, those are things that are out there so people can
that's all on the church
learn.
website.
Cool. I've learned a ton, and I've also taken up a ton of your time.
So fun.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hugely appreciate it.
Yeah, come see us.
Okay, we'll do.
And good luck with your, and God bless your efforts.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Quick observation. No, actually, a couple of quick observations. And the first one is just Father Barry Vaughn is wonderful. This guy is a fountain of knowledge. He knows all this stuff off the top of his head. He's put a ton of time into this, and he would never say it on camera, but he has got rock star advanced degrees from rock star institutions. He carries himself with humility and kindness, not like he's trying to impress you. Huge thanks to him. If you're in Las Vegas, stop by that church. I think you'll really enjoy it. But here's the second observation. I went the day before to an Anglican church, a traditional Anglican church. And that was very intentional. Both of these were in Las Vegas, just across town from each other. Both of these guys were fantastic. If you want to see the video from the Anglican church, I'll link it somewhere or something. But these churches are not in direct fellowship with each other anymore. A lot of times you think about churches, especially within Protestantism, and gradually you maybe come to a different theological conclusion than another Protestant church, and it seems like it just split off and split off and split off. Maybe that's one of the weaknesses of Protestantism. But I didn't see it as a weakness between these two guys. I could have poked and prodded Barry Vaughn. I could have poked and prodded Gordon Hines over at the Anglican Church as much as I wanted, and they just weren't going to take mean shots at each other. They seem to really appreciate that they both exist. And they seem to really appreciate that they both need to exist. These churches have different takes on some, frankly, pretty secondary things in the grand scheme of God and the Bible and salvation. But it would be really hard for them to function together as effectively as they could the way they're doing it right now. And so, I don't know, I've been around Christians where they're really mad that somebody doesn't think the same thing they think. And it kind of feels like maybe getting after each other a little bit. But I've also been around Christians who come at it more like these two guys. That was encouraging to me. Seemed to be in keeping with the spirit of this whole endeavor. So thanks a ton for going to another church with me, for learning about another tradition with me. I hope it's having the same weird effect on you that it's having on me. It's certainly softening, and that's really fun for me. As always, if you like this stuff, I would be enormously grateful if you would hit the subscribe button. The reality is I want you to see these. I'm excited about them. I want to share them with you. And the way YouTube does it now, if you just hit subscribe, you're not necessarily going to get notified. They're doing all kinds of new stuff with the algorithm. And so if you subscribe, it makes it more likely that they will show you what I do. If you really want to see these, or even if you just kind of want to see these, if you could click that little bell, that means you get notified every single time I publish something like this. For those of you who are really resonating with this stuff, and would like to do something to make more of it happen, you can go to patreon.com/TMBH. That is pretty much how I fund these kind of adventures, and it does take help, and you offer it. And so thank you to everybody who already kicks in $1 or $2 per video. Some of you do even more than that, which kind of melts my brain. But I'm able to do this stuff, which I wasn't able to do in the earlier days of this channel, entirely because you exist and you decided to kick in a little bit on these videos. So thanks a ton. If you want to be a part of that, patreon.com/TMBH
If you don't, that's no problem as well. Either way, thank you for being interested in this stuff and for being so charitable as well. I'm Matt, this is 10 Minute Bible Hour. Let's do this again soon.